It is an honor, Ambassador Siokolo, and a privilege to welcome everyone to this important Interdepartmental Workshop on the Regional Indicative Strategic Development Plan. So we have an MTDP in our country, which is the Medium-Term Development Plan, which mirrors some of the indicative strategic development plan initiatives for 2020 to 2030 towards South Africa's SADC chairship strategy. Ambassador Siokolo, you're quite right. We meet at a very pivotal moment for South Africa and our region as we prepare to assume the chairship of the 46th Southern African Development Community Summit under quite complex and rapidly evolving regional and global fluid conditions. Colleagues will recall that following the 45th Ordinary Summit held in Antananarivo in Madagascar in August 2025, South Africa was elected incoming chair for the 2025-2026. Of course, subsequent to those developments that we are familiar with, saw South Africa assuming the role of interim chairship or chairperson in November 2025, ahead of formally taking over the chairship in August 2026. So of course the interim chairpersonship of SADC also coincide, Ambassador Siokolo, with us assuming the chairpersonship of the Trans-Kalahari Corridor on both ministerial and management level from the 1st of April 2026. So this responsibility will also see us playing quite a major role in the region. And of course, that tripartite boundary corridor development and the management organization, which includes ourselves, Botswana and Namibia, contributes to forging deeper regional integration in the Southern African Development Community and of course, in the Southern African Customs Union, SACU, and of course, in the new Partnership for Africa's Development, NEPAD. Of course, as Home Affairs, it will be amiss of me not to reflect on this, Ambassador Siokolo. We're just fresh from engaging with the public on immigration matters. The context was Cabinet's approval this month of the revised white paper on citizenship, immigration and refugee protection. This is a government policy that will inform the drafting of a new legal framework for regulating citizenship, immigration and refugee matters in the country. And as we know, for SADC, which accounts for roughly 80% of South Africa's international migration population, the policy resonates as it speaks to the new migration system we're forging. I think amongst the most important tenets is the adoption of what we call a first safe country principle, in terms of which asylum seekers who travel through other safe countries before reaching the Republic of South Africa will not be eligible for asylum. This constitutes another important area for collaboration with our neighbors on the first safe country principle. Now, speaking of low-skilled migrants, I think I should reflect as well that we are currently engaged as the Department of Home Affairs in rigorous public engagements exercise on the future of what is known as the Zimbabwe Exemption Permit and the Lesotho Exemption Permit, or LEP. In a nutshell, just to recap, you will recall that previous ministers of Home Affairs had introduced what is known as the Documentation of Zimbabwean Project, or the DZP, in 2009. And of course, Professor Van Niekerk and Professor Lapierre will agree that following the global 2008 economic meltdown, the economies of the region could not cope. And therefore, the South African government had to introduce this initiative to regularize Zimbabweans that were coming into the country. So that DZP was then replaced by the Zimbabwe Special Permit in 2014, which was later replaced by the Zimbabwe Exemption Permit in 2017, and then of course in 2016 the Lesotho Special Permit replaced the LSP with the LEP in 2019. And you'll recall that in November, after consulting Cabinet, the department had released a public statement announcing the decision to terminate the ZEP program. And following that legal challenge by the Helen Suzman Foundation, the court then mandated the department to conduct a process compliant with what is known as the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act, or PAJA. It is this that informs the public consultation process that I alluded to earlier on, that we currently are undertaking on the future of the ZEP. Now, taken all together, these developments that I've indicated, I think they place upon all of us a responsibility and an opportunity. I think we bear the responsibility to provide steady leadership during a period of transition, but this task presents for us an opportunity to shape regional integration in our favor. I think it's a task that calls for practical, responsive, and a firm focus on the implementation, including on the African Continental Free Trade Area. In our engagements last week with the Kingdom of Lesotho, we are considering what is known as a Pan-African model that will look at how do we then manage relations between ourselves and Lesotho, informed by examples and learnings that we picked up from Senegal and the Gambia. If you look at the Gambia, completely surrounded by Senegal. Lesotho, completely surrounded by South Africa. We've got about 14 points of entry with Lesotho, which in our discussions we're trying to reduce to at least 11. The others will be what is known as community crossing points. Lesotho is basically in our belly. For transactions to happen, they have to go through South Africa. So what we learned from the Gambia and Senegal is that they have what is known as a permanent secretariat, which looks at trade flows, which looks at how to deal with issues around migration, and of course, in our case, we'll need to look at how do we then deal with issues relating to the supply of water that we get from Lesotho. So those are matters that are still under discussion. I was sharing with Ambassador Siokolo that someone says Basutos don't need to have passports anymore to come to South Africa, which is not true. We are not there yet. This is part of issues that we are discussing, and issues related to regional integration. Of course, we do support the Continental Free Trade Area, particularly by ensuring that we have a focused attention on the transformation of our borders into efficient, technologically driven, and enablers of trade. And to this extent, we are working with SARS with regards to what we call smart borders. Now, this will ensure that if a truck, for example, leaves Johannesburg en route to Libombo, and you would have seen 20 kilometers of trucks that are stuck on the roads, whether it's Libombo or Beitbridge. Now, through the Smart Borders initiative, it therefore means that using technology, you don't have to stop anywhere because everything will be automated. That means your truck will have been pre-cleared, and by the time you get to the port of entry, using what we call the electronic travel authorization, it picks up facial recognition and then you proceed. And then it then notifies the owner of the cargo where the cargo is. So we're making quite a good progress with regards to that. And you will recall that we currently, or in the next few days, the Minister of Home Affairs will then announce a massive project with regards to the 6 land ports of entries, in particular with our neighboring countries, of course, Beitbridge with Zimbabwe, Lesotho with Mozambique, Aseru Bridge and Fixback with Lesotho, and then Kopfontein with Botswana, of course, Oshuk with Eswatini. This is a massive public-private partnership that we will be embarking on, led, of course, by Treasury and the other colleagues. This project, we are of the view that it will have extensive benefits for the region, especially if you are to consider the extent to which the creation of a one-stop border post will modernize processes. Others now speak of a smartless or a no border that we should not envisage at these areas. So it will cut, of course, the red tape, reduce waiting times at land ports, no doubt, boost intra-trade. And of course, both our own National Assembly and the NCOP have already passed the bill to give effect to this. Now, of interest, in your own publication, which is the MISTRA publication, referred to as Reflections on Africa's Place in the World, the Geoeconomics of Global Trade, Implications for African Continental Free Trade Area, Prof. Lapierre and Walters et al. Argue that an essential building block of the Continental Free Trade Area is what is known as the Tripartite Free Trade Agreement. For sure you will share more with regards to that. Now, that needs together, Ambassador Siokolo, the three regional economic communities of Southern Africa. This is SADC, and then East Africa, the EAC, and of course the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, COMESA. And of course the TFTA represents the Cape to Cairo axis of the Continental Free Trade Area and will involve 26 countries. So you can imagine the magnitude of that with a total population of 632. That's when he wrote the paper there. For sure the populations would have increased by quite a lot. And then of course a total trade of about 1.2 trillion US dollars. That's 60% of total of Africa's output. I think, colleagues, you will all know that the global environment which Ambassador Siokolo characterized earlier on is also characterized by fragmentation, economic nationalism, and then intensifying geostrategic competition. In such a context, regional cooperation is no longer an option. It is essential. So regional blocs such as SADC have become instruments of collective resilience, economic sustainability, and strategic bargaining power while remaining actively integrated within the global economy. And for sure, Prof. Lapierre will speak about a proposal that he made much earlier, many years ago, around how we might want to de-link from some of those activities. Is that still relevant? For sure, you will be able to elaborate on that. Encouragingly, the SADC region continues to demonstrate resilience. And if you were to look at the estimates that were provided by the African Development Bank, the SADC regional GDP growth is projected to stabilize and strengthen between 2% and 5.5%. Of course, that's subject to revision downwards given the global turmoil that's currently around us. And of course, you also have challenges around global supply chain disruptions, including fuel shortages and hikes linked to the war in the Middle East, which are likely to weigh on this outlook. Of course, although still relatively low, intra-regional trade has shown improvement, reaching an approximately 23% according to the latest available stats. Inflation has moderated and total regional trade remains significant. Now, this resilience that we're talking about must be viewed alongside persistent structural challenges. For example, manufacturing contributes just over 12% to regional GDP, reflecting limited value addition. And I was saying to a colleague that if we were to look at ourselves, South Africa and Zimbabwe, and you look at the total platinum deposits that we have, collectively, we should be controlling the value addition with regards to platinum. And of course, ensure that the hydrogen fuel cell industry is heavily influenced by what we do. Now, of course, in our case, you will note that public debt remains elevated. Of course, the challenges that we are familiar with around unemployment continue to pose a serious socio-economic risk, particularly youth unemployment. This observation, colleagues, reinforces this core principle that South Africa must approach regional integration from a dual vantage point, anchored in both regional responsibility and, of course, national interest, in line with the DIRCO National Interest Framework document. I hope it's being revised, Ambassador Siokolo. As one of the largest economies in the region, the country carries a responsibility to advance regional stability and development. And I shared with you the genesis of those dispensation permits, because by 2008, the South African asylum system could not cope, which is why South African government had to introduce the ZDP and the LEP. Now, by 1994-95, our asylum seeker program had about 10,000 asylum seekers applying. But by 2008, that number had grown to 200,000. So the system basically collapsed. That's the reality. And therefore, government then had to introduce that ZEP and LEP. But those were short-term measures. These special dispensations were not new. You will recall that in 1974, when both Angola and Mozambique attained their independence, there was a special dispensation that was introduced for Portuguese nationals that were coming into the country. But then it was a limited number. And when we opened up for the region, we could not cope. So we have that responsibility to ensure that we advance regional stability and development. And of course, that perspective was shared by His Excellency President Ramaphosa at the 6th South Africa Investment Conference a month ago, where the President reaffirmed our position as one of Africa's most credible and compelling investment destinations. And you will note that the President also announced that 889 billion in new investment pledges, which comprise 415 billion in confirmed fixed investment, and then the 475 billion from development finance institutions. These are DFIs across 81 projects in all the 9 provinces of the country. Of course, these investments are not only to drive domestic growth, but also to generate significant positive spillovers for the wider region. Now back to the discussion here around the midterm review of the RISDP. I think this, as Ambassador Siokolo indicated, it's an important moment for us to reflect, but also to calibrate. You will all recall that the findings of the midterm review, which were presented at the recent Council of Ministers meeting, which was held here at this venue at DIRCO, are clear that the RISDP remains conceptually sound and, of course, aligned to our regional aspirations. However, if you look at the performance, it's been uneven, but also constrained by systematic challenges. So we've been only able to achieve at least 63%. And amongst others, this will include, these are the challenges: underfunding, limited institutional capacity, weak coordination, and significant data gaps, with less than half of the agreed indicators supported by baseline data. Importantly, accompanying the midterm risk assessment further sharpens our understanding of these constraints. Of course, while the region remains stable, it continues to face risks from weak early warning systems. Of course, from Home Affairs, I can talk about porous borders that we are trying to address, working with the Defense Force. The biggest challenge that we have is transnational organized crime and organized crime within the country. And of course, the uneven political commitment. Ambassador Siokolo, is a tough challenge in Benin, you have a 45-year-old, a president, but in the neighboring countries, they range around 82 and 85. But I leave that to Ambassador Sokolo to deal with. So if you were to look at issues related to infrastructure development, it's hampered by regulatory fragmentation, financing gaps, and climate-related disruptions. This initiative that I spoke about with regards to the redevelopment of the 6 ports, it's been in the pipeline for more than 20 years. But that announcement will only be made next week, including the duration that it took us to set up the Border Management Authority. And I hope that era has passed, where we'll now move to implementation. So these pressures that I've spoken about, including issues related to the shattering infrastructure, climate change, youth unemployment, skills mismatches, irregular migration, and health system challenges, I think they all form formidable challenges that really underscore the need to enhance coordinated regional response. I must reiterate, colleagues, that these risks are not theoretical. They are reflected in the lived realities of our region. We know that more than at least 58 million people across the region face acute food insecurity. We know how the food and mouth, or FMD, has had a devastating impact on livestock and has significant economic impact. At the same time, the region continues to carry a significant burden of disease, including tuberculosis, placing additional strain on our already constrained health system. I think the message is quite clear, colleagues. The region does not suffer from a shortage of frameworks. Our challenge is execution. All these projects that I've referred to, we could have activated them much earlier. It is precisely within this context that today's theme, strengthening national regional linkages, is both timely and necessary. So as I move towards closure, I think the forthcoming chairship is expected, amongst others, to focus on industrialization, infrastructure, agriculture, and of course critical minerals, whether it's zirconium, whether it's palladium, all those minerals. These are not new priorities, you will recall, colleagues. The intention, I suppose, Ambassador, is not for us to develop a new framework, but accelerate implementation by identifying at least 5 high impact priorities. Not 10, at least 5, that which will be achievable. And I suppose this requires a fundamental shift from policy articulation to coordinated action, from commitments to measurable outcomes, and from fragmented efforts to a whole of government approach. I think the presence of the SADC Secretariat and our knowledge partners is invaluable in helping us ground our discussions. This GNU, when it started, it said it will base decisions on evidence. And that's why we're here. Data, evidence, and practical realities. And I suppose the success of South Africa's chairship will hinge on collective action, as the RISDP spans multiple sectors and demands coordinated delivery across government. Opportunities and prospects abound for us. Implement national regional linkages. As a case in point, it's what I've referred to about the large platinum deposits that we have. Now that's an opportunity for us because we know the mining sector has been declining over a number of years. In fact, the Minerals Council of South Africa, which has 68 member organizations and represents 90% of mining production value, had indicated to us that the number of foreign mine workers employed in South African mines has decreased significantly over the last 20 years. Now, the Mineral Council says in 2005, from the SADC region, we had about 100,084 mine workers. That number has shrunk to 26,599. So you can imagine the impact in Mozambique, the impact in Lesotho, impact in Malawi. I think this decline may create a strategic opening for regional cooperation and good prospects to evolve from labor exporting to an integrated economic partnership. A window of opportunity opens to cooperate also on regional industrialization strategies. In fact, I recall there was a SADC industrialization strategy that leaders had adopted some times ago. I'm not sure if we are monitoring what has happened to that. Of course, you do say, Prof. Lapierre, that regional integration in Africa has been a hotbed of divergent interests, with multiplicity of agreements, programs, processes that are simply declaratory and to which do nothing more than reinforce the hard sovereignty of African states. And you continue to say this has produced an incentive environment that is predominantly state-centric and elite-driven. For sure, they will debate that in the room. The question for the continental free trade area now is, how do we turn our regional economies, how do we turn the AU integration architecture into meaningful and value-adding vehicles for social and economic transformation that will improve the lives of ordinary citizens. So it is against this background that today's workshop, I hope, Ambassador Seokolo, will deepen our understanding of the RISDP and, of course, engage in the midterm review and assessment and clarify our role in implementation for the benefit of the region and, of course, the African continent broadly. Agenda 2063, we hardly reflect on it. Where are we with regards to that? So I think today's pivotal engagement will also provide a platform for aligning priorities, strengthening cooperation with the SADC Secretariat, and defining clear chairship action. And as I close, allow me, Program Director, to encourage all participants to engage openly, constructively, and with a very clear focus on solutions. I was sharing earlier on with the EU ambassador, one of the biggest sponsors of scientific innovation in the country, and they supported us on the Square Kilometre Array Initiative in the Northern Cape, which is a project that was built on time, within budget, but it's a global project that at inception was never meant only for South Africa. It's always meant for the benefit of the entire continent and the region. So the true value of this workshop does not lie in what we say today. The true value of this timely workshop lies in what we do differently tomorrow. And perhaps we can heed the advice that the economists shared with us in 2019, when that publication indicated how do we turn the continent and its citizens into winners by being able to insist on a form of globalization that works for Africans and foreigners alike. And of course, drawing inspiration from Nelson Mandela's address at the 1997 SADC Summit, let us remember that it is only when our efforts, and I quote from him, are seen by the majority of our people to have an effect on their own everyday life that SADC will continue to have a legitimate reason to exist. Thank you so much, Program Director.